Hi, everyone. So the title of my talk is Improving Typography for an Improved User Experience. And what I'm going to cover is how we can start using rich typography in the browser. And I'll talk a little bit about where we used to be in terms of typography and web design and where we are now, or where we could potentially be right now, but we're not. So there's going to be a little bit of CSS, but I don't want anyone to get alarmed, okay? It's, you know, CSS is easy, right? So I will show you a little bit of it, but nothing too crazy. Okay, so who am I? That's my job title. We can move on. All right, start with a quote. So here's a quote. Web design is 95% typography. A contentious quote made in 2006, which may as well have been the 19th century in web design terms. So that quote is from Oliver Reichenstein. I don't know if anyone knows who Oliver Reichenstein is. He's the principal and founder of a company called Information Architects, and they are the, well, I suppose they're best known for a Mac and iOS product called IA Writer, which is a writing tool. But they also do user experience design for a number of very large websites, particularly in Germany and in Japan, and these tend to be large news organizations. And one thing that news organizations are dependent on is typography, because we're reading things on there. Okay, he got a lot of flack for this quote, by the way, but 8 years ago, and I think if I can make a prediction, this is a prediction I made like last year at another talk I gave, and I've changed it slightly because at that talk I didn't say will bring a typographic revolution, I said is bringing. But now I've changed my mind because I'm not seeing it really. Apart from, you know, design sites, we're not seeing good typography on the web, even though we can easily create good typography on the web with the tools that we have. So I've changed that slightly. It will bring a typographic revolution to web design, as great as desktop publishing was to print design. So I still stand by it, but not yet. Okay, so here's another quote. Optimizing typography is optimizing readability, accessibility, usability, overall graphic balance. Organizing blocks of text, isn't that what graphic designers, usability specialists, information architects do? So why is it such a neglected topic? Who's this quote by? Oliver Reichenstein. From the same article in 2006. So I can understand why this was such a frustrating thing for him in 2006, that we have terrible type on the web. And there were a number of historical reasons for this. So why has typography been neglected? So now we're going back to, you know, eight or so years ago, and the first argument there was always against rich typography online was that there are too few fonts available. That's no longer the case. And I'll talk a little bit later about why that's no longer the case. The second argument, which is definitely no longer the case, was that screen resolutions were too low, and we would get pixelated fonts and anti-aliasing, and they would all look terrible. That obviously is no longer the case with Retina displays and so on. The third one is browser support. So very few browsers were supporting CSS properties that allowed rich typography. Again, that is no longer the case, with an exception. I'm sure you already know what that exception is. The copyright issues. As soon as I have a typeface or a font file sitting on my server, anybody can come along and download that typeface or font file and distribute it freely and use it however they want. Type foundries are particularly concerned with copyright, and they kind of make the motion picture industry and the music industry look like they don't care about copyright in their pursuit of copyright violations. There have been a number of high-profile cases with people using unauthorized typefaces on their websites and getting sued for lots of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, just for one font file. The highest profile one was a Texas senator whose web design company used an unauthorized font file on the site, and he was sued for $250,000. That's a lot of money, especially here. And then finally, it's easy to use defaults. Yeah, so people can be lazy, let's face it. Let's just use the default line height in the browser. Well, what's the default setting? Let's not worry about it. Let's not add anything fancy to this. Get that font in there, we're done. And that unfortunately happens a lot of the time. Okay, so why should we care about typography? Well, much of the web is about reading. 95% of the web is about reading. And good typography is going to enhance that experience. It's just a given. I don't need to give you statistics or anything about that. I think we can all agree that if something's readable, it's enhancing an experience. And so here's another quotation. This one goes even further back, in the annals of history, the Middle Ages of web design. Designers will benefit from approaching their work now and again as being written rather than assembled. And this is from a List Apart article by Dean Allen in 2001, where he makes the case for reading on the web and how we're not designing for reading. Okay, we're not designing for reading. Type is ornamental a lot of the time and not readable. Okay, so where do we start? Now, typography is hard. Let's not kid ourselves. Yeah? Just terms that relate to typography, there are literally hundreds of them. That's just a couple. I'm not even going to bother reading them because I'm sure they're largely meaningless in this context. Yeah. Okay, but so that's just a selection, and that could really be 10 times as long, the number of terms we have related to type. And if we look at the anatomy of a typeface, hand glovery, a word that does not exist, but is nice to show different letter forms. So if I draw a couple of lines here and dissect the word like that, we have a cap height, which is the height of your uppercase. We have a baseline, which is where your lowercase letters align. And then we have a bunch of other terms at the bottom, and then we have a bunch of other terms at the top. And that's just a few of them. Okay, there are actually a lot more than that. So I'm not saying we all need to go and learn all of these things. There's one thing we need to keep in mind, and I'll get back to this later, and that is what we call X height. And X height is the height of a lowercase letter. Okay, and generally speaking, the bigger the X height, the more readable the typeface is. As a general principle. That's not the case for all typefaces. Okay, so where do we make mistakes with type? Well, I mean, the most common one for me, and especially as I get older, and recently had to get spectacles, I can't read small type easily anymore. Yeah, and the text is too small. So when we first started using CSS or just plain HTML, there was let me rephrase that. When we first started using HTML, there was a particular default font size in the browser. And despite, common misconceptions, it's not 12 pixels. Yeah. It's 16 pixels. And it's always been 16 pixels as the default font size in the browser. But we made it smaller. And we made it smaller because we had such low resolution screens. If you've got an 800 by 600 monitor, and now I'm really giving my age away, 16 pixels is too big, and 12 pixels is about right, depending, of course, on the typeface. We don't have 800 by 600 monitors anymore. We have retina displays. We have a whole range of device screens, and they're high resolution. 12 pixels is really tiny on those screens. I can't read it. Lines are too long. Yeah, so we have very long lines that become unreadable. There's optimal reading lengths for lines, and there's arguments about that, but generally we're looking at between 40 and 70 characters per line, and generally most lines are over 120. There was an article in Smashing Magazine a while ago that went and looked at top websites globally with the highest traffic, and line lengths averaged over 100 characters. Okay, that makes things very difficult to read as well. There's not enough white space. I will show you an example of this shortly. So I'm sure we all know what that means. There's very poor layout consideration of titles and subtitles. I see this all the time. Yeah. And it still surprises me a bit that these mistakes are made. You need to accommodate titles and subtitles in a design before you making something live, because you never know how that content is going to change. Yeah. A single line title in a mock-up in Photoshop, amazing. Someone goes into the CMS and the SEO specialist says, no, you need 20 words in that title, please. And your layout is destroyed immediately because you haven't considered titles and subtitles and the changeable nature of content. Links are a massive problem. They're not clear. And they're always missing active and visited states, which is one of the very first things we had in HTML. Before we had CSS, we had active and visited states for links. Yet they just seem to be ignored, or they made all the same color, which is pointless. And text is not treated as part of an interface, okay, but in a decorative fashion. Yeah. So it's not considered how type enhances and improves the interface. Type is often decorative for the sake of it being decorative, yeah, and that helps no one. Okay, so I'm not sure if you can see this. It's a terrible screenshot. So, but can anyone recognize that website? It's not News 24. I avoided anything 24. Mail and Guardian. It's the Mail and Guardian. I read the Mail and Guardian a lot, but I never read it at that size because I can't. So I just want to show you the actual Mail and Guardian site. Now, Apple in their user interface, user experience disaster, you can't actually Command Tab in Keynote anymore. So I actually have to go out of this, and then I have to go to Chrome. And then I have to drag it across. And then it's the wrong side. Okay. So, hooray. There's the Mail and Guardian. Now that looks really big here. It's tiny on my screen, and I always actually read it like that. It's not that size on my screen, obviously. But I actually increase the text size, otherwise I can't read it properly. And another example is the Daily Maverick, which again has tiny type size, and again I increase it, and then heaven forbid that I actually go and read the comments. Well, discuss is not loading, but the font size there is almost 1.5 times now bigger than the body copy size. So then I have to zoom out, because now it's too big. Okay. So we have a lot of these issues. Compared to The Guardian, who are rolling out a new redesign, and you can see already what a difference that typeface, the type there makes. It's evenly spaced, it's nicely spaced, it's much bigger, and it's much readable. And you can see this also on the New Yorker's new design, which I've got there, which, let me show you quickly. The New Yorker, sorry, no, never mind. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so hopefully now I can get this back. So that's the Mail and Guardian, and their font is Open Sans. So they've at least not using Helvetica or Arial or Georgia, which is it's a step. But it's 13 pixels. Okay, so they've gone like 1 pixel higher than we used to be for like 800 by 600 monitors. And that's really not enough. They have a decent line height, yeah? So line height space between the lines, it's 1.7. Well, I probably shouldn't get into why pixels are bad. So it's 1.7, and that's quite readable. But look at the space between the paragraphs. It's almost the same as the line height. And in fact, that is a margin at the bottom of 10 pixels. So you've got a font size that's 13, you've got a line height that's 22. That means you've got 7 pixels above and below a line. So it's like 3.5 below. And then you've got 10 pixels between the paragraphs. And if you look at it, the space between the paragraphs and the lines is almost the same. A little bit bigger. Very hard to read. The Guardian, by contrast, well, the Guardian, you know, they've got so much money, they've got their own font, which is called Guardian Text Egyptian Web. Okay. And they set that at 16 pixels or 100%, okay, which is the browser default. You can already see how more readable it is, even though their line height is smaller than on the Mail and Guardian. It's 1.5. It's a reasonable line height because we've got a bigger font size. Yeah? And they have a margin of 16 pixels, same as the font size. And you can see the spacing between the paragraphs there. It's already a lot easier to read. Okay, so this is what screen fonts used to look like. And now we're going, you know, 80s, early 90s. And they were bitmaps. That's Apple's first font. Sorry, second font. I can't remember what it's called now. Damn. The quick brown fox jumps over a lazy dog. Okay, so that's what they look like. But we quickly had a number of font format changes, which I call the font wars. It wasn't really a war. There weren't running battles in California between Apple designers and Adobe designers, but there were a lot of proprietary arguments. So Adobe came up with Type 1 fonts, or PostScript, and then Microsoft, and joined by Apple, TrueType. And then Apple said, okay, thanks Microsoft, but now we're going to do this thing called Apple Advanced Typography, or AAT, or GX Typography, etc., etc. And these are all digital fonts now. And then Microsoft said, well, okay, Apple, we're not interested in what you're doing because you actually won't give us that technology, which they asked for. And they said, we're going to Adobe, and they then collaborated on OpenType. So who won the war? OpenType. So the Microsoft and Adobe format OpenType won this particular battle. And, you know, why did it win this particular battle? The reason for this is that OpenType offers a very accessible and advanced typographic tool set that you don't have in TrueType. And it improves on PostScript and TrueType in a number of ways. First of all, you've got one style in one file. With TrueType fonts, if you want to build them, you have a massive amount of files that need to be compiled. And they can have far more characters. So one PostScript file could handle 256 characters, while a OpenType file can handle 65,535 characters or glyphs. So you can have all sorts of extensive language support, internationalization, advanced typographic features. You can have subsets, ligatures, all those types of things built into one file. So it's an example, like FF meta in PostScript would be, we would have 4 styles. We'd have 360 files, and it would be 23.6 megabytes. In OpenType, the OpenType equivalent for FF meta, 4 styles, 4 files, and it's 676 kilobytes. So you can see the difference and the advantages there. So you've got much smaller file size, and you also have access to over 65,000 characters or glyphs. So why should we care? Well, we should care because of this thing called @Fontface, which is a terrible, terrible term when you think, you know, really. And it's a, you know, let's take font and typeface and put them together. Yeah. Okay. This wonderful thing @Fontface. So I'm sure you're familiar with these. Yes, you are. Web-safe fonts. And there are a couple more you might be able to get away with, but those are kind of foolproof. Yeah. Well, not Helvetica, actually, because that's only on a Mac. But Arial, Helvetica, Georgia, Courier, and Times New Roman. I could add Verdana to that, but no one wants Verdana. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It's extremely readable. It's specifically designed for the screen, not for print at all. It's one of the first typefaces designed specifically for the screen, and it does a very good job on the screen. Okay. There we go. We no longer need those. Okay. So the first browser to support embedded type and via something like Fontface was Netscape Navigator 4 in 1994. I used Netscape Navigator in 1994. It was amazing. Okay, but embedding type was a nightmare. You had to do something like this. Oh, I can't really see that. But horrible, horrible proprietary code, not standards-based at all, and it only worked in Netscape Navigator 4. Right, so I couldn't find a better image of this, actually. This is actually from a talk that Jake Archibald gave on performance. But it says there, embedded fonts in Microsoft IE4. Okay. And that was in 1997. So that's 17 years ago. Embedded fonts were supported in IE4. So, I mean, all the things we say about IE, they did support a lot of things before other browsers did. Not always in the best way, because they used a proprietary font called EOT, which stands for Embedded OpenType, which they copyrighted and said you may not use this unless you are IE. Okay, so there are two technologies, Microsoft Typography, which is EOT via Fontface, and Netscape, which are using something called Bitstream TrueDoc. Bitstream actually were taken over by Adobe. They were real pioneers in digital typography. But it was a PFR font file, which no one has ever seen again, with a horribly invalid code that was up recently. So, you know, we've got some problems. Microsoft Typography, EOT is proprietary, and you needed a browser plugin to render it in Netscape, and that was a Java applet. And then Bitstream, on the other hand, for Netscape, and you needed an ActiveX control to run that in IE. And then you also needed to manually refresh the page after you'd activated the ActiveX control. So a bit of a nightmare. And so this is one of the reasons why we didn't have rich typography. Even though it was enabled in these early browsers, it was largely ignored because of all these proprietary problems. Also, Netscape being when they went Mozilla Foundation, everything had to be open source, and this is still the case with Mozilla and Firefox, which is why you should use Firefox. It's all open source, and they don't use any proprietary technologies. So anything that is patented or copyrighted or anything like that will not find its way into a Firefox browser. And it was the same with Netscape. So Bitstream actually they said, no, we're not going to do it anymore. So we had no fonts. So Fontface browser support, well, in 1997 we had IE and IE4, and we had Netscape. Now, it's been in IE ever since 1997. And then there's a big jump to 2004, and we have two truly awful things. The first one, the blue icon there, is for something that was called Kufon, which went and wrapped every single word in your text in a tag, and then applied JavaScript to it to replace it with a font that you converted via an uploader to be able to run in JavaScript. So literally every single word got wrapped in a span tag. I think it was a span tag, something like that. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It wasn't pleasant. And then, of course, there were loads of copyright issues with that, with people converting fonts that they weren't really supposed to, which weren't open fonts via Kufon. And then we had, that's a flash, the flash icon. We had something called SIFR, which rather egotistically, the SI stands for the person who invented it, Sean Inman. So it was Sean Inman flash replacement. And what this did was, it took whatever text you wanted to use a particular font with and converted it into a flash movie. So an SWF file. And if you had 20 titles on a page and you wanted them all to be a particular typeface, they would all become Flash movies. Excellent. Of course, the web being what it is, and designers and front-end developers being like, it's shiny, it's new, use it everywhere. Okay? This sometimes happens. So those kinds of things are used all over the place. In my current work, where I've only been there just over a year, but I inherited a project when we got there that we do kind of servicing and updates for, and this site is using Kufon in 2014. And we can't change it. So it's still out there, and it's being maintained by me. Okay, 2008, so in 4 years, we still got IE, and Safari comes to the party. Safari often doesn't come to the party. Apple don't engage developers at all, and they kind of do what they want with Safari releases, but we got Fontface with Safari in 2008. And then in 2010, we still have IE, and then we get Firefox, and then we get Opera, and finally, the last browser to support Fontface was Chrome. So that's 4 years ago. 4 years ago. And for 4 years, we've been able to use a wide range of typefaces on the web. But we're not really seeing this happening. So, and one of the reasons for this is that at the beginning, it was quite difficult to use, because we had 4 different proprietary not proprietary, there were 4 font file types, and you had to essentially load up 4 different versions of a single font file to get it to work across browsers. So there was EOT, which was the Microsoft format. Microsoft went to the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and said, let's use this, it's great. And the World Wide Web Consortium said, no, it's not really. I mean, SVG, which we had to use on iOS 6, okay, and then TwoType or OpenType, which are standard formats, and then WOF, Web Open Font Format, which is developed specifically for embedding fonts in web pages. Okay. Right. So I've got a lot of stuff about where it's supported or not. I'm just going to go through that really quickly. Yeah. The only thing to note here is like IE 6 to 8, and our second column there doesn't support WOF. Yeah, okay, it doesn't support WOF, IE 6 to 8, but does support EOT. All right. Firefox, it's all good. Safari, it's all good. Opera, it's all good. Chrome, it's all good. Support all the browsers. You need to load up all 4 font files, and the syntax is a bit nasty, but hey, copy and paste, right? Okay, so WOF is going to win this. Again, there were battles, Microsoft, EOT, etc. WOF will win for a number of reasons. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically uses the same table structure as OpenType that I was talking about earlier. So it means it's much smaller, and you got access to all these characters and glyphs in one font file. Okay, and it's compressed. So it takes a font file that's potentially large and compresses it, but without losing any fidelity, without losing any access to characters and glyphs. And WOF 2 has just been announced, but not supported anywhere except in Chrome. Like, that was built yesterday, and you download it today. It's called WOF 2, imaginative. And that compresses the file even more. So with WOF 2, we're actually getting the normal WOF file now compressed again by about 50%. And then the other important thing, one of the things I mentioned earlier as a stumbling block was copyright. People don't want their font files to be sitting on servers. WOF, because it's based on OpenType, allows you to embed licensing information in the actual font file. And this is what brought Type Foundries on board with allowing typeface embedding. Okay. And now you can pretty much get any typeface you like at a fee to embed on your website. And that's because the licensing information can be embedded in that. And a WAF file, you could reverse engineer it, but who's going to do that? Okay, some people will, but most people will not. So you can't grab a WAF file off a server and suddenly start using it in Illustrator or InDesign or whatever. It just won't work. Okay, so licensing information. So WAF advantages, it's compressed, less bandwidth, we're going to load things faster than any other font format. And again, licensing is quite, font vendors are quite willing to license these files. And it's supported by Proprietary and free software browser vendors. So Proprietary would be IE, and free software would be all the others. Okay. Sorry. So, sorry about this. Quickly get back there. Sorry, never mind. The answer to that table is yes. Okay. So, and then mobile browsers, the only place we have a problem is Opera Mini, which doesn't support Fontface at all. So it's not that it doesn't support WAF, it doesn't support Fontface. Okay. There are ways around that, but that's a complicated front-end dev talk. So this also means now that we have a WAF format, we have access to OpenType font features. Okay, and OpenType font features allow us to have rich typography. What do I mean by that? It means we can support expanded character sets and layout features. We can have rich linguistic support, and we can have advanced typographic control. And just one font here, instead of a whole range of different fonts. Okay, so we can cover all the world's languages, nearly, and we have non-standard glyphs. So we can have things like old-style figures and tabular figures and small caps and all these types of things, but real things, not like the browser will make this italic. Okay, proper ligatures and so on. So I'm just concerned about time, so I'm going to maybe skip a few things. So this is CSS Fonts Module Level 3. It was last updated in October 2013. It's pretty stable, and it introduces something called Font Feature Properties, and it expands something called the Font Variant Property. And we have a shorthand for a set of properties that provide control over all these stylistic font features. So you want ligatures, font, variant, ligatures, enable. Okay, as simple as that. You want kerning, font variant property, font variant features, kerning, and so on. Okay, so we can now enable all of these in the browser. So the syntax looks like that. You would say, what is the font variant I want, and what is the property? Okay, and then there are a bunch of properties that you can apply to that. So there's a whole, there are like loads of OpenType features. They all get a rather odd 4-letter acronym, or acronym, anyway. So frac, for example, would be fractions. Okay, so now in the browser, if you want a fraction, you've got a problem. Yeah? You can't actually write a fraction in HTML. But now you can. You write 1/3, and you say font variant fractions, and you assign that fraction, and now suddenly you have fractions. So there are a whole range of these things that we can now use in the browser. And these are the ones that CSS allows us to use. So we've now got language-specific display, kerning, ligatures, sub-superscript, real sub-superscript, capitalization, numerical formatting, alternate and swashes, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so these are all things that have only become available within the last year or so. Let's use them all now. No. Okay, so I think I'm just going to skip over the next few slides because I'm a bit concerned about time. 5 minutes, yeah? So, but this is on slides chair, so the next few slides basically go, this is how you do it, okay? So, you know, browser support, none, but let me just navigate somewhere else. So here's an example, just quickly. So that would be swashes, okay, of a particular kind. And you can see on the C and the K that, and the Q, that enables swashes. That's one example, okay? There are loads more. I actually have a whole HTML demonstration of this that I'll also link to. Okay, so skipping over those examples, one of the important things that we're looking at here is readability versus legibility, okay? And they're not the same thing, often confused. Legibility means, well, I can interpret this, okay, and that's okay. I know what this means. But readability means, oh, sorry, what did I just do? And how do I get it back? I don't know. I have to, thanks, Apple. That's what I wanted, you see. Okay. So, not the same thing. I can interpret this, but readability, you have an emotional connection with the act of reading. Yeah? So you actually enjoy reading this thing. It's not a chore. It's not difficult. I can do it. As Stephen Coles, who's a quite well-known type designer, says, you know, it's something, not can you read it, but do you want to read it? Okay, and that makes a huge difference between readability and legibility. And they're kind of two opposing positions here. There's Massimo Vinelli, famous New York designer responsible for pretty much every single sign in the city of New York. I can write the word dog with any typeface, and it doesn't have to look like a dog. But there are people that think that when they write dog, it should bark. Okay. And that speaks to two different approaches to typography. And I guess the kind of counterpart to that is David Carson. Does anyone know David Carson? Yeah, so he's famous for Ray Gun magazine, where in one issue there was an interview with Brian Ferry, and he thought the interview was really boring. So he set the whole thing in dingbats. And this was actually published, and, you know, and people turned to, oh, Brian Ferry, and it was, you know, it was just symbols because he didn't like the article. So that's kind of an extreme opposite position of that. I'm on this side of the fence, so to speak. Yeah, David Carson also, in an interview I read, said that, you know, overall people are reading less, and you kind of have to go, well, yeah, you know, it's probably your fault. So there's some things we need to be aware of here. Yeah. So there are lots of pitfalls. You know, just because we have lots of typefaces, you know, more fonts does not mean better typography. It just means more fonts. Yeah. So we need to be careful about that. And, you know, many current fonts are not optimized for the web. Beware Google web fonts. Yeah. Some of them are fine. A lot of them are terrible. They're missing characters. They're missing subsets. They don't read well at small sizes and so on. So it's a problem with, you know, free fonts. As I've just mentioned. And of course we're looking at an additional load time whenever we want to use rich typography. And there are ways around that, but again, that's more of a front-end thing. So some things that I think you should do is, you know, to settle on a typeface as early as possible. And for me, the typeface is the most important design decision. Okay, and it's something that I think about before I even do something like a wireframe. Yeah. Because why not put your actual typeface in your wireframes? Yeah. You're already solving a lot of headaches down the line. So, and a corollary to that is to get type in the browser as soon as possible. You can have your pixel perfect layout in Photoshop. It's kind of meaningless for type. Yeah? You want to have that type in the browser. Otherwise, you have no idea how it's going to render, how it's going to wrap, how it's going to work on screens. Your Photoshop file works perfectly on your monitor. You don't know what people are going to do in the browser. And this is something Steve will talk about. Okay, you don't know what's going to happen. So get type in the browser as soon as possible. Optimize loading on mobile. That's really important. Obviously, you don't want to be sending, 18 Fontface files font files down to a mobile device. And line widths at breakpoints, something that gets neglected is we have nice desktop layouts, and what happens when we are working in responsive design, line lengths become particularly problematic at certain breakpoints. They're too wide or they're too narrow. Design for and use existing CSS properties that have widespread support. So we've already got size, and we've got weight, and we've got letter spacing, and we've got line height. We have all of these things. They're supported everywhere, and we should use them. And then we can, of course, expand on those with rich typographic features. And organize a design with regards to the message and with readability in mind. Okay. And then finally, you can consider a hosted solution. So there are lots of paid for services that will allow you to use pretty much any typeface that exists. You can get it in the browser. Okay, and that's it. I've put this on SlideShare. That's just the URL to my profile, but there's a link there. It is capitalized for some reason. I don't know. So it's all up there. And then I've also done a kind of HTML example where you see anyway, we'll tweet about it or something, but you can visit my website, and there's some type examples where you can click a button to enable ligatures, enable kerning, and it'll show you the difference and so on. We'll have that URL later. But I think I'm out of time.